Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Dr. Victor Picard, who is an assistant professor in the Annenberg School of Communication at Penn, and he's written a book that is very near and dear to my heart, America's Battle for Media Democracy, The Triumph of Corporate Libertarianism and the Future of Media Reform. This is important to me because, of course, I'm a comm professor, and media is important to me, but also unregulated corporate libertarianism is of concern in a lot of fields, but it's particularly important in media because of the effect it has on our democratic society. Dr. Picard, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, John.
This is an interesting and well-researched book, and it talks about the policy origins of American media regulation, and apparently a lot of things came to a head in the 1930s with the Federal Communications Commission and radio.
That is true. Definitely in the 1930s, there were a lot of key decisions being made, and especially in the 1940s as well, which is what a lot of my research focuses on, looking at this battle over what the social contract should be between broadcasters, commercial broadcasters in particular, the FCC, and the public. There were a lot of interesting policy battles that took place throughout that decade of the 40s.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's start with how the New Deal figures into this.
Sure. So what was interesting is that the New Deal project, which tended to be anti-monopoly, assumed an activist role for government. This was in various stages of retreat by the early 1940s, but it arrived later and stayed longer at the Federal Communications Commission, which, of course, is the regulatory body that oversees much of our media system, and it arrived in the person of James Lawrence Fly, better known as Larry Fly. Certainly not a household name today, but in the early 40s, he struck fear in the heart of commercial broadcasters.
Mm-hmm. And he and an associate who came on the commission later, Durr, had a lot to do with trying to get media to be more responsible in its broadcast, concerned especially about the commercialization leading to what one might consider lowbrow programming, pretty much.
Yes, that's true. And, there was often a tension with this kind of, like the lowbrow critique of radio programming, sometimes shades into a little bit of elitism, elite-sounding critique. But I would argue that they were primarily concerned about radio serving as a democratic force in society. And by the 1940s, there was this anguish that this still new medium was not living up to its democratic promise, that all the things it was supposed to do, many of the things that we hear today about the Internet, how this medium is supposed to revolutionize society, democratize the way we talk about important issues and govern ourselves. This was not panning out for radio by the 1940s, and largely because of this over-commercialization. And I think that is what people like Larry Fly and Clifford Durr, another Southerner, at the FCC, they were trying to advance this progressive vision for radio.
Mm-hmm. And while I myself enjoyed the Lone Ranger and the Green Hornet and singing commercials and so on, what they wanted was programs that would sustain a broad spectrum of political views and be fair and balanced in that regard, as well as representing minorities well and unions well and so on. Is that?
Absolutely. That's very much how they would describe it. And even though these were interventions coming from the FCC, sort of, more of a top-down process, they were responding to these social pressures from below, where people were saying, these are the public airwaves, and broadcasters are making tremendous profits with their monopolistic use of the public airwaves. What do they owe society in return? And many people just wanted to see a more diverse range of views and voices. And it was a fairly reasonable intervention, but of course it ran into a lot of problems, especially as American society shifted into this kind of anti-communist hysteria moment in the mid-1940s.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's a big part of this context, isn't it? The communists. Well, first the fear of fascism, and then following on that, the fear of communism, that made people uneasy about any kind of regulation.
It's absolutely true, and I don't think we as a society have really come to reckon with this legacy from the 40s. A lot of people think it's McCarthyism, which really didn't start until about 1950. This anti-communist hysteria really took hold earlier in the 1940s, and it changed the political landscape dramatically. It really made it very difficult to advocate for even the most innocuous and fairly reasonable government regulations, because they were automatically dismissed as being socialist and communist stooges.
Mm-hmm. So the first federal law about the FCC basically declared the airwaves belong to the people. And that's probably at the heart of this debate, the way I read it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, that was kind of a rallying cry. The air belongs to the people. This was a slogan that many groups that formed this media reform coalition in the 1940s really embraced and tried to, educate the public, remind people that this is a public resource, kind of like national parks. And yet they're being dominated. In the 1940s, they were being dominated by really, in the early 40s, we're talking about two major corporations, CBS and NBC, and people were concerned about that. They were concerned about this over-commercialization and also that it was at the mercy of these enormous, powerful media monopolies.
Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting interpretation of the First Amendment, and there are two opposing views as to what constitutes freedom in that regard.
That's right. Yeah, that was central to these debates. This idea, in fact, broadcasters, whenever the FCC tried to push these public interest obligations, the commercial broadcasters accused the FCC of attacking free radio. And they really wrapped themselves up in the First Amendment and said, these regulations are an infringement on our First Amendment rights. And, this is an interesting move because when you think about it, first they're saying that these broadcasters, these companies, should be treated as individuals, and that their First Amendment rights trump the rights of everyone else's, including other groups, but the public and society writ large. And I think you see this logic play out today in many interesting ways as well.
Indeed, it just looks like history repeating itself so much. But I wanted to touch on that article that Clifford Durr wrote, How Free is Radio?, warning that radio was becoming predominantly an advertising medium and moved from diversification to concentration, and propaganda against government regulation tempted people to ask the government not to protect them. But Durr said in many solemn warnings during the past year or so that the despotic government bureaucrats are plotting to snatch away freedom of speech. And he just wasn't concerned about that. Corporate power was the true enemy for him.
Yes, he tried to make this clear, and among some progressives of the time, I think of them as social democrats, a kind of ideological position that's very hard to find in our current political discourse. But they were trying to say that, of course we need to fear government power. We need to fear concentrated private power as well, and in the corporate sector in particular. And so to try to show that it's not just big government taking over our media that we need to worry about, we also need to worry about big corporations taking it over, and that this could be just as propagandistic and dangerous for democratic society.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about some of the battlegrounds then. Larry Fly started with the support of FDR on newspaper-owned radio stations. That was a big deal.
Yeah, so that was FDR's biggest concern about how newspapers were rapidly buying up all these radio stations and creating these massive media conglomerates. And this was particularly true because, unlike today, this trope of the liberal media was not in circulation. And in fact, most people, when you're talking about the press in the 1930s and 40s, you would assume that it's a fairly conservative force in society. Definitely, at the very least, they were anti-New Deal. They were very much against FDR's agenda. So Larry Fly, who is this tough liberal Texan, came in. He was appointed in 1939, and he was kind of FDR's hatchet man. He was thought of as this anti-monopolist crusader, and carried out this anti-monopoly agenda. But he also went a little bit rogue while he was at the FCC, and at one point FDR tried to sort of rein him in But Larry Fly just kept going after these radio monopolies in particular, and really did some interesting things while he was at the FCC.
Mm-hmm. And that early concern with newspaper radio ownership also blossomed with the restructuring of broadcasting when NBC had to divest themselves of their Blue Network, I guess it was.
Yeah, and I mean, this is truly remarkable. It's fairly inconceivable for us today, but one of the first things that Larry Fly did when he got to the FCC was take this languishing report. It had been this pretty mediocre study on the state of American broadcasting, and he transformed it into what later became known as the Monopoly Report. And he used the findings of this study on the lack of competition in radio markets across the country to pass new rules that forced NBC to divest itself of one of its two major networks, which is actually how we got ABC. And this was essentially trust-busting media monopolies. It would be like Tom Wheeler at the FCC today forcing Verizon or Comcast to break itself into two. It's beyond our comprehension, but this is what the FCC was doing in the 1940s.
Mm-hmm. Interesting note that I wasn't aware of. The artist bureaus allowed broadcasters to negotiate terms that benefited them instead of the artists themselves. I think we're seeing that with the recording industry again today, that the artists are losing out to the corporate interests.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, again, a case of all that's old is new again. Mm-hmm. These patterns replaying out, and you're right. I mean, Fly was able to pass a number of these new rules that made it a little more competitive, a little less vertically integrated in the broadcast industry. And it's hard to pinpoint. I mean, one of the things that certainly did not happen that broadcasters were claiming would was that they did not lose out on massive profits. This did not hurt their bottom line as they tried to convince everyone that it would. But yeah, Fly was and the FCC was able to do a number of these measures that really tried to democratize radio. Although these anti-monopoly efforts weren't, even though they were quite dramatic in this kind of trust-busting way, they weren't enough to democratize radio to the extent that reformers wanted to see, and that's why they next focused on the FCC Blue Book report.
Yeah, I want to get to both the Mayflower and the Blue Book report. Let's just go right there.
Sure. So maybe I'll jump on Mayflower after the Blue Book, even though it did happen a little bit earlier in the decade. But of course, that's how we got the Fairness Doctrine in the late 40s. With the Blue Book, so-called because of its blue cover, its official name was the Public Service Responsibilities of Broadcast Licensees. And essentially, after these monopoly efforts hadn't really transformed the radio landscape, they tried to focus on how broadcasters held on to their licenses to the public airwaves, and they tried to create these meaningful public interest obligations that if broadcasters did not satisfy them, they would actually lose their license. And this again is pretty unthinkable today. Just to give you a sense of how rare this has been, in the last 80 years, only 4 broadcasters have lost their licenses due to public interest violations. In the last 35 years, it has not happened once. So this is a pretty unthinkable thing for us today, but in the 40s, the FCC was trying to create this regime by which broadcasters would have to satisfy these public service responsibilities. And not to leave your listeners in suspense, but they were not successful. This
Right.
was not a successful effort.
Yeah, and the battle was awful between the NAB and the various broadcasters, and what they were up to in part was some really important stuff. The racist caricatures in Rochester and Jack Benny and Amos and Andy and all of that stuff was concerned, but they couldn't attack programming directly, which is why they went with a structural approach, and that's probably why it didn't have the teeth, because as you say, not many licenses were denied.
That's right. I mean, I think there's this larger sort of narrative arc in the 1940s, because at the beginning of the decade, again, you saw these really structural anti-monopoly efforts, and then gradually they started focusing more on programming regulations, which once you start doing that, at least in my view, you're focusing more on the symptoms of the problem instead of the root causes. So, instead of looking at this monopolistic takeover of our media and this over-commercialization, you're trying to shame media corporations into being good, by putting some regulations in there to try to incentivize them into being socially responsible. And I think history shows us that this has not been a successful strategy. But I also think that the FCC, especially because of the red baiting that was happening, really didn't have many other choices.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that caused the battle cry to be heard across the broadcast industry was talk of nationalization and the influence of Seepman, who was from the BBC, and the BBC model was attractive to some of those in the FCC.
That's true, and in fact, they accused Seepman, and I always trip over this word. They accused him, because he was the main author of the FCC's Blue Book, they accused him of trying to BBC-ize American radio, which was, I guess, one of the worst possible things. But you're right, and in fact, there was a debate going back to the 30s where people focused on the fundamental nature of American broadcasting, whether it should be private and commercially driven or whether it should be more of a public subsidized model like the BBC. By the 1940s, it was pretty clear that it was going to be predominantly commercial, but they were trying to work in these kind of non-profit, non-commercial pockets into the otherwise commercial landscape. That's what the FCC Blue Book tried to do, and of course, broadcasters didn't want that to happen. Commercial broadcasters didn't want that to happen.
Mm-hmm. And the broadcasters' counterattack was pretty harsh. I think it was at one point NAB leader Miller was his name. I think he said the Blue Book authors were stooges for communists and obfuscators and professional appeasers and astigmatic perverts, and they got some nasty language going back and forth.
Yeah, that last one, astigmatic perverts, I have no idea what that means, but I would hate to be called that.
Right. Just put a couple of bad words together. Well,
That's right.
The battle for the Blue Book didn't really gain what the regulators hoped that it would. But let's touch on the Mayflower and the emergence of the fairness doctrine then.
Yeah, so the Mayflower Rule was something that Larry Fly did earlier in the decade, in 1941, passed this regulation that broadcasters were not allowed to politically editorialize, which sounds pretty severe, but at the time, again, we were talking about CBS and NBC really dominating the landscape. There was fear that these media monopolies had just too much political power. They had too much control over this still, at least in theory, public medium, and so they placed these constraints to make sure. And of course, as you noted earlier, this was still during World War II. There had been fears of fascism. They just didn't want to have the broadcasting limited to these handful of voices. But after the Blue Book was defeated, commercial broadcasters set their sights on knocking down the Mayflower Rule, and that was the last big policy battle of the 1940s. And it's sort of ironic because today, when you hear the fairness doctrine, at least among progressives, it's thought of as this high watermark for enlightened media policy. You hear like if we just had the fairness doctrine back, we could have a more balanced media system. But in the late 40s, when they first passed the fairness doctrine, it was seen as a consolation prize for these stronger, more structural regulations. Reformers were not happy with how the fairness doctrine came about, although it would be used by activists on the left and the right during the ensuing decades after 1949.
Mm-hmm. So, in context, this is emerging at a time when liberals are losing ground, and they're in retreat almost. FDR's passed away. The New Deal agenda is being torn apart. Truman has sort of a market-friendly orientation. It's just a shift, a significant political shift.
Yeah, it really was a dramatic shift. And, I mean, by the late 40s, the last of the New Deal holdouts, people like Clifford Durr, were being chased out of D.C. You had Truman's loyalty program, where government employees were forced to sign loyalty oaths. It was a really dark, oppressive time. And many of these the last of the New Dealers were scattering across the country. You had some of them take refuge in communication departments, as a matter of fact, including Dallas Smythe, who was one of the founders of the critical political economy school of media studies. I kind of think of him as like my grandfather or great-grandfather, because I come from that kind of intellectual lineage. But yeah, so they went on to do very interesting things. But in terms of media policy, it was a real turn, and I think it really shaped our media system to present day.
Now, one of the things that unfortunately doesn't apply anymore was the scarcity rationale, and that's at the heart of the FCC's position at the time, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, the scarcity rationale basically assumes that not everyone can have access to the public airwaves. Not everyone can afford the equipment that a radio station requires. And so you have to have this kind of social contract. There has to be this sort of transaction. If you're allowed to monopolize the public airwaves, you have to deliver on certain public interest obligations. But this is exactly what was being defeated throughout much of the 40s. And the fairness doctrine, to use that as an example, people often conflate that with the equal time rule, but it was more progressive than that. It actually had two parts. The first was that broadcasters had to cover issues that were important to local communities, controversial issues, and then to present them with opposing and balanced views. So in some ways, it was the first part of the fairness doctrine that was more even radical, you might say, although that's often forgotten today.
And interesting reading about the public leading up to the hearings that I guess was part of the demise of this Mayflower thing. I mean, the people that joined forces, the American Jewish community, the Lawyers Guild, the CIO, there were all these concerns with groups that now don't have much power, don't have much influence.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But at least in the 40s, they were creating this media reform coalition, and they were really trying to advance. I mean, they didn't want the Mayflower Rule to be repealed, first of all, but they also were using this as an opportunity to really air this kind of alternative vision of what radio could and should look like in a democratic society. And it's that vision that you see kind of rise and fall in the 1940s. And there would be glimmers of it again. You saw some progressive policy making in the 1960s, for example, but most of this got wiped out during the 1980s, during the Reagan administration.
Oh, yeah, that was a time when it was bad to be a government regulator, for sure.
Government was the problem, according to President Reagan.
Right. But one more effort from the 40s is the newspaper crisis and the Hutchins Commission. Probably I'll talk a little bit about that, too.
Yeah, so often in these conversations, it's tempting to just focus on the FCC because that's where all this dramatic action was taking place. But also in the 40s, one of the main case studies in my book, America's Battle for Media Democracy, is that newspapers were in crisis, and they were also these same questions about radio. They were trying to figure out what is the role of print media, and really they were looking at the press in general. What is the normative role? What is the role that the press is meant to perform in a democratic society? And this Hutchins Commission was a convening of America's top intellectuals at the time, and they were really grappling with, how do we create a press system that's more democratic? Do we leave it entirely up to the market? Should it be only commercial? Should we have nonprofit models? Should the government intervene and try to create these public interest protections? These were the things that were being fought over, and in the end, they ended up with a fairly industry-friendly report, but that was not inevitable. There were some good debates along the during the process of that.
So these policy battles, the Blue Book, the Hutchins Commission, went through trying to let us know the common critique of the press and the media was that they were not providing the public service that democracy needed. And it was a strong argument. It was a rational argument. But after the popular critique, then the counterattacks were so powerful from commercial media, and finally they wound up with industry-friendly agreements. That's
true, and I don't think they could have done that. I don't think that industry could have inherited such a friendly framework if it hadn't been for all the red baiting of the 1940s. And the red baiting pushed out the more, again, social democratic progressives and liberals, pushed them out of the conversation, and it also chilled. I refer to it as a return of the nervous liberals, but liberals, as soon as they would stray into a kind of structural critique of the media system, arguing that it's too commercial, we shouldn't just leave it up to the market, they were afraid that they started sounding too much like socialists. Mm-hmm. So they would sort of walk that back and fall back on kind of these industry-friendly recommendations, like, for example, the press should remain self-regulated. As long as it's socially responsible, then it should just be self-regulated, and the public has nothing to worry about. That was kind of this libertarian resolution that came out of these debates.
Mm-hmm. Now, a postmortem that you have in the book, I starred this paragraph. Had progressive reformers such as Durr and Archibald MacLeish prevailed, had policymakers coordinated more effectively with social movement groups, had Cold War anti-communist hysteria not snuffed out much of the 40s progressive potential, today's media system would likely be more diverse and less concentrated, more public service-oriented, less commercialized.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a fair assessment. Of course, that's why I wrote it. I mean, people can always disagree over these historical interpretations. It's always a fraught enterprise to draw up parallels and counterfactuals, but I think the evidence is there, and I think at the very least we would have had a different media system today if these debates had gone differently. And I think in many ways you're seeing some of these same patterns play out also, I mean, in different ways as well, around contemporary debates like net neutrality, for example.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the ruling yesterday?
So I think it's a fascinating case study, and I plan on doing a lot of work on this, so I'll have more to say in the months to come. But right now, my first reaction is that it was a true rare victory for the public interest.
Yeah, I was surprised.
A lot of people. I mean, by yesterday, most people knew what to expect, but 6 months ago, no one would have ever predicted this. Right. So I think it's a testament to the power of the people in terms of shifting these media policy debates.
Mm-hmm. So you've been through this thorough history in this book, and it's well documented. And I want to say thanks to Cambridge University Press for using footnotes instead of endnotes, because it's so much easier to get to the notes that way.
Oh, I couldn't agree more.
But your conclusion about confronting market failure, just say a few words about that last chapter, because it's sort of where do we go from here?
Yes, that's kind of the what is to be done chapter, which I think too often scholars don't get to that question, and I try to in all of my work. So I argue that, and of course this is easier said than done, but really we're going to have to shift the paradigm about how we understand media and how we understand the relationship between media and commercial markets. And I think it's fair to say that there is always some degree of market failure. Media produce information that's essentially a public good, and markets don't support public goods to the extent that a democracy requires. So we have to take that into consideration as we create smart policy. And I think that's exactly what we need to do, whether we're talking about fixing the digital divide or thinking about the future of journalism, which also is not being supported by the market today.
Mm-hmm. That's all the time we have, unfortunately. We've been talking with Dr. Victor Pickard, who's done an excellent work that's titled America's Battle for Media Democracy, the Triumph of Corporate Libertarianism and the Future of Media Reform. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you, if you don't hear our broadcast the 3 times it's on 88 FM, you can catch us on YouTube. Just search for Good Books Radio Strong and Cook, and you'll find our YouTube recording there. Thanks once again for listening. We are underwritten by audiobooks.com. Audiobooks.com. Try one for free.